what now? What makes this sort of interesting in terms of GMing stuff? Well, it has a lot to do with how things might double up. So, for example, who nothing constrains the interaction of issue owner, shock owner, and antagonist player. It is true that if you're a protagonist player, you can't own the shock, and vice versa. We knew that. But let's look at this, okay? If we take a scene with a protagonist going on there, the shock owner will always be the same person through play. There's only one person who owns the shock, and that just happens through all the scenes. So that person is busy in a specific way that no one else is during the game. And then, if you have a situation, though, where you're the shock owner and you're the antagonist player, so it's the person to your right happens to have a protagonist, so you are ipso facto the antagonist player. So that means you are owning the shock and its role in what's going on, and you also are playing the antagonist. So all of a sudden you're sort of more than just a shock owner or just an antagonist player. The same thing goes for the issue. It could well be that you are the shock owner throughout play, and this particular time, the protagonist is playing who happens to be associated with your issue. So again, you're different than just a shock owner or just an issue owner. You're both for that protagonist. Can it be that all three, through the vagaries of kind of who's sitting where and who took ownership of what, be the same person? And sometimes that is the case. Sometimes that's the case where you are going to be playing the antagonist. And it so happens that that protagonist is wrapped up in your issue. And throughout play, you're the shock owner. So you're like kind of pretty GM-like at that point. I mean, all the other people can only contribute the minutiae of their issues, and that's it. So it all depends on how it played out. If you have more protagonists throughout the group and you have a particular confirmation of seating and who chose what, you might end up with very spread out relations among shock owner, issue owner, and antagonist player. The protagonist situation is a lot cleaner because you can't be a shock owner and a protagonist owner. So therefore a protagonist player. So that's not going to happen. And you also can't play a protagonist regarding your own issue. So that's not going to happen. And you can't play your own antagonist to your protagonist. That's someone else. So that's not going to happen. So the protagonist player is a little bit free of those differing, organizational nuances. But the way those things are entwined or combined per other person playing may take on very, very different shapes for each protagonist. So you can actually map it all out, but you don't really have to. If you look at that basic diagram, you'll see. Given that it all makes much more sense when you set it up with a group and you don't really try to strategize it, and you'll just see how it shook out in terms of, for a given protagonist, who's playing what that time. So let's take a look at an example. We had a game with 4 people, and therefore we had 1 shock and 4 issues. And as it happened, only 1 person played a protagonist. So this was a very focused, this story was all about them. And that meant that these roles didn't shift around. It meant that for every scene, we all had the same kind of input throughout. So it was a little more stable in its confirmation of who is talking about what and toward what end than most games of shock. So in this case, we have the shock was aliens live among us and have been for a long time. And it's a recent discovery, that they're here. So that's the shock. And then the issues were, let's see, there was food distribution, food production and distribution. There was the value of labor. There was divorce and fidelity. And then there was housing. So those were the issues that were laid down. And each of those, is potentially shocked by these aliens living among us. Now, given only one protagonist, which one was kind of going to be the issue of play? And since this would be stable throughout play, all the other issues become minutiae only, just contributors and context for the specific interaction of the issue and the shock. And as it happened, Henna, playing the protagonist, chose the issue of food production and distribution. And that was also interesting in our case because I was the shock owner, and so I was ineligible to play a protagonist, even if I had wanted to. And it was my issue. So all of a sudden, I realized in every single scene, I was going to be playing the issue and the shock. And this was, a fairly potent set of things to have to be in charge of. So I was a little more game mastery than I was sort of expecting to be. Just luck of the draw, right? That somebody chose that issue. Not really luck of the draw. Someone chose it, but not up to me. So then it so happened, fortunately, I think I just didn't want every single, weapon in the arsenal, if you will, that the antagonist player in this case was Helma. So so first of all, let's look at the diagram and make sure you understand that we have Sam, who's going to be contributing housing minutiae all the time, but will not play a protagonist or an antagonist, and isn't the shock owner. So Sam has kind of this supportive role throughout. It's just whenever housing crops up as part of the situation, which it tended to do, Sam was on that. Or if one of us had a thought about housing, Sam kind of had the nod for it, or a modification, or no, that's not how it works, or whatever he wanted to say about it. So it also meant that the other issues, as well as Sam's, were also only going to be present as minutiae. So that was the value of labor, that was divorce and fidelity, a fairly focused story about Henna's protagonist facing the food production and distribution issue as shocked by aliens living among us. And Helma is playing the antagonist, which happened to be the food ministry, in that. Now, this is important because it means that Helma, not being the issue owner and not being the shock owner, when she played the food ministry, which could be anything. I mean, it could be any personalized element of a great big organization like that is eligible to play. So she could play this or that clerk, or she could play this or that, manager, or any aspect of that ministry. Just, it should have volition, whatever it is. So, however, she didn't own the issue of food production and distribution as affected by the shock. That was me, and I had both ends of that. So in many ways, Helma playing people in the food ministry or messengers or anything like that, Helma was almost playing a player character. I mean, a very big player character with lots of different aspects, but still wasn't really in as much of a contextual game master role. She was playing an antagonistic entity in that situation, which I happened to have these two powerful sets of context for. So that put the three of us, Helma, Henna, and me, into kind of a state of constant play, and Sam got to kind of drift back a little and, sort of adjust the housing dial as he needed or felt. So that's how our game went all the way through. Now, hypothetically, Work with me here. Hypothetically, let's say that Sam had a protagonist too. And the way that I've written this out, I do have to look at my notes for this one because it didn't happen. Let's say that Sam played someone named Bella, and that the antagonist player was Henna, and that the issue owner was Helma. So it's completely different configuration. The only thing that's the same for this person's turn, same game, this person's turn, the only thing that would be the same is the shock owner, because that's the same all the way through. But let's take a look at the difference between what did happen in play throughout with Henna's protagonist. Let's say we then shifted after one of her scenes to Sam and said, okay, it's your protagonist's go now. Where is he? What's he doing? Where are they? Whoever, whatever. And what are they doing? So let's take a look at the little diagram I've got here for that, which would be that there's the protagonist player, Sam, playing Bella, and they also can bring in their own issues minutiae, which is housing, as usual. Just like I could bring in minutiae about food production and distribution on all of the scenes for Henna. We look at the issue owner with Helma, and we see that it is divorce and fidelity. So that means that the protagonist that Sam made up is very wrapped up in that issue in some way and has some sort of goal regarding that in the context of that issue as shocked by the aliens among us. Okay, so then I'm making all this up myself right now. This didn't happen. Henna perhaps would say, all right, so there's this organization, Zelda, and it's a bunch of separatist aliens, and they're all about, we had to fake being married to you people and stuff like that, but, well, we were disguised as you, but we're not anymore, so they become kind of this extremist, separatist alien group, dedicated very much, against no more, unnatural coupling. So that would be then played by Henna in these scenes with Helma as the issue owner and me as the shock owner. So now you see how things are a little different. Now, not one person is no longer the shock and issue owner, like I was in Henna's scenes during the real game. Here in this sort of hypothetical alternative where we had this other protagonist, now when Sam is up with his protagonist, then Helma's playing the issue and I'm playing the shock, and so I don't have the same sort of uber contextual authorities that I had for Henna's scene. Hopefully this is starting to put it together for you, how play would be subtly shifting around with who gets to have authority over what in terms of its emphasis as we go around. Okay. I think that covers the conceptual orientation and the setup of the game in terms of how it's going to be conducted. Now, one thing that I'm not going to go into, except very briefly, is the ins and outs of resolving a crisis, which has to happen in a scene. It doesn't have to happen right away, and in my opinion, it does a lot better to kind of build through play without planning what the conflict's going to be. There's nothing in the rules that said, figure out, conference out what the conflict will be. Terrible idea. Game doesn't say to do it, so don't do it. So when you do arrive, the antagonist player is supposed to be very adverse. So not too hard that either the protagonist is going to kick up enough fuss or the antagonist is going to make up enough opposition and trouble and perhaps danger that we will be needing to roll some dice. Well, what you need to know about that, and without going into all the numbers and stuff like that, the first thing is that it is not an oppositional roll. Or more accurately, it's not a straightforward oppositional roll. Both the protagonist and the antagonist player have to state goals, and those goals have to be orthogonal. Both could succeed, One could succeed and one could fail. The other could succeed and the other could fail, or both can fail. You must understand this is the way that any conflict situation in shock has to be set up. And it helps if you know that, so that when we go into the conflicts, you have already, your antagonist goal is like right there standing on the table, unmistakably. And the protagonist's goal at that time should be similar. And we know that they're not going to be contradictory because we know we're not supposed to do that. Okay. Now, when we roll, it is each player's choice to invest in going after their goal versus opposing the other one's goal. So you can kind of look at the situation and say, which one do I kind of care more about? Do I care more about, getting this than I do stopping that? But they come to their decisions privately on that, and we roll. Now, everybody else, there's only 2 people rolling at this point, but everyone else at the table also gets to roll. Not much, just a little D4, but everybody gets to do it. Those, for purposes of this conflict resolution, all these people at the table are called audience. So all you need to know about that is that once the dice settle, we look at the 2 sets that the protagonist player and the antagonist player have rolled. And we've got we learn right away how it looks. Either they're both going to succeed, either one will succeed and the other one will fail, or reverse that, or both are failing. But all is not done. We've got to look at where those dice have come to rest. Now, the person with the highest audience die on a D4 can take that value and can throw it in on any of those 4 numbers. Yay versus its nay, or the other yay versus its nay. So that person goes, which one of those can I tweak as I desire with this? Note that they obviously have the option to throw it in a way that doesn't affect any of the results, if that's what they prefer. But there you go. So all of the minutiae of all the issues can be brought into the fictional situation. If the audience member does change up the way that the dice initially came to pass for one of those conflicts, one of those goals, then that person gets to narrate the outcome of that. We know succeed or fail. That's fixed by the numbers. But it's that audience member who gets to say if their die contribution made the difference. If that's not the case, and it will not be the case for the other yes or no, then the respective successful opposition or successful protagonist will say how it plays out. So, therefore, audience members are contributing, and potentially, and you don't know which one, to the outcome of the conflict, which incidentally is surprisingly fun. There's a sense of participation in all of this I have found, people kind of get real energized about that, which is nice. It looks a little fiddly, and you have to learn how rolling over and rolling under and all that sort of stuff works. But that's subroutines, conceptual subroutines, and I'll leave that to you. Okay, now there are a couple of other things that are probably a bad idea to bring up right now. One of them is that if you lose a conflict, that you can transform, which is basically sacrificing one of your links. They're a renewable resource. You will always get a replacement link, but the point is that you were so unkind as to, or maybe, who knows, maybe it's a positive transformation, whatever. But there's a big change in your character's relationships, and you can do that, as a way to get the conflict extended into more roles. Another thing is that there's the potential for an interesting kind of tie in one or both of the conflicts. And when that happens, then there's kind of a sudden death where the next audience highest die is going to be the eligible one, and then the original dice are rolled again. Anyway, So you can get kind of a sudden death extension of the conflict that way through a tie. Those are definite subroutines, neither of which has to be understood or memorized before play. Now, what about the overall structure? I mean, how long do we do this? That's actually really well constructed in this game. Every antagonist player has 13 story credits. And for every conflict that they are being antagonistic in, they will be spending story credits. And you have to spend at least 3, and you can spend as many as 6. So that's how many dice you get to roll, too. So, you say, I'm spending 6 credits, you're picking up 6 dice to roll, which you'll split between getting your goal versus stopping theirs. All right. Then, what does this mean? I mean, do you just play out all 13? No, you don't. The rule is that if, for that protagonist, if a given conflict, we look at it and we kind of look at the story goal that they have written down, and we go, kind of looks like we've done it. I mean, this, when all is said and done, we know how this is played out for your character, and the basically this protagonist's confrontation with this issue as shocked is done. When that's the case, the protagonist looks at it and says, "Hey, we're done with this guy. This dude's, gal's, whose ever story is over." And that can happen at any time, except for the first round. First scene they're in, that can't happen. Any time after that, it can. But let's say it doesn't. If it doesn't, then when it is that protagonist's turn, and you pick up your antagonist sheet, because you're the antagonist this time, and you look at it and you go, oh, well, I have 5 or less story credits. That means that you've got to set up the antagonism in this scene so that it will conclude the story goal. Basically, don't screw around, finish them off. So that this conflict will close out the story for this protagonist. So, and it's kind of nice. I mean, if you get there on your own pretty quickly, you do. If you don't, then there comes an alarm bell that tells the antagonist player, zip it, it's done. Finish it. So that, I believe, is what you need to know about shock, except that you might want to look at that grid and say, well, hold on, is every game of shock just one column, one shock? The answer is yes. And so if you wanted to continue playing, either changing a protagonist or doing things with this protagonist, assuming that they survived, then there will be a new shock, and we will, that new shock will probably have a new owner, and then we will continue to play basically from scratch in terms of story credits and things. So there you go. I think that's covered pretty much my understanding of the game, with 1 or 2 minor points about play left. One is that there is no excuse not to play it like a normal role-playing game. You have game mastering going on, you have scene framing going on, and then you have the protagonist walking and talking, doing things, and a whole bunch of people who are capable of playing characters in that situation. Because everybody has minutiae for at least their own issue. We also have the shock owner and the issue owner and the antagonist player. And so all kinds of things can happen. People can talk about all sorts of things. And we also know, and it maintains focus because it's only the antagonist player through the antagonist character or entity who's bringing the pain. No one else has to do that. Even if your issue brings untold pain upon some other protagonist, when it's their turn, in this person's turn, your issue is not, important. And so you can just have it be in there, contributing in some way. There's lots and lots of room for other little things too. You can have more than one protagonist in a scene, although only one is up for the role. But the other can be there, so the characters can know each other if you want. You could have, basically be a book of short stories with 5 different protagonists if you had 6 people. Or it could be, much more of an interwoven thing where we are looking at different people facing different, well, they can, if they were all facing the same issue, have a bunch of protagonists who are even a team of some kind. That could happen. So, all sorts of different ways that it can shake out and organize itself. And therefore, you really are creating your own social science fiction with a particular configuration of protagonists relative to the fiction of the moment and with its own configuration of people contributing to its content per scene. So, best I can do. It sounds really complicated, but you know what? It's really straightforward. There's not even a single teeny tiny thing that you don't do in role-playing games that many, many more people are familiar with.